Good afternoon. My name is Ali Aouni. I'm from the Gerhard Center, American University in Cairo. And it's a great pleasure to have you all with us today in today's session of the Gerhard Center webinar series, The Aftermath of the COVID-19, the New Social Impact Ecosystem. The series was launched in April with the aim of discussing concepts that are currently not mainstream and may or perhaps should become mainstream in the aftermath of COVID-19. Today is the 13th session, and it's a pleasure to have with us Professor Colin Mayer. Colin Mayer is a Peter Morse Professor of Management Studies at Said Business School at the University of Oxford. He's a Fellow of the British Academy, the Center for Economic Policy Research, and European Corporate Governance Institute, a Professional Fellow of Wadham College, Oxford, an Honorary Fellow of Oriel College, Oxford, and St. Anne College, Oxford. He's a member of the UK Government Natural Capital Committee, the Board of Trustees of the Oxford Playhouse. He was a member of the UK Competition Appeal Tribunal and the International Advisory Board of the Securities and Exchange Board of India. He was chairman of Axera Limited between 1986 and 2010 and is a director of the energy modeling company Aurora Energy Research. He was appointed in 2017 Commander of the Order of the British Empire, CBE. He leads the British Academy inquiry into the future of the corporation. His most recent book, Prosperity, Better Business Makes the Greater Good, is published by the Oxford University Press. Professor Mayer will talk about a timely topic, the impact of COVID-19 on business. He will discuss how business will and should respond to the crisis in the short, medium, and long term, and how this will affect relations between business and government around the world. The presentation of Professor Mayer is going to be for 30 minutes, and then we'll allow 20-25 minutes Q&A round. And you may, if you have questions, you may type it in your chat box. It's all yours, Professor Colin. It's a pleasure to have you, sir, with us.
Ali, thank you very much indeed for that very kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be with you and to be able to speak to you this afternoon. I'm going to be talking to you about one of the most important institutions in our lives. It's an institution that clothes, feeds, and houses us, that employs us and invests our savings. It's a source of economic prosperity and the growth of nations around the world. But at the same time, it's been a cause of increasing environmental degradation, income inequality, social exclusion, and mistrust. In response to the COVID crisis, Edelman, the company that does surveys of trust, produced a special report of its trust barometer. It recorded a few weeks ago that less than 40% of people globally believe that business is doing enough in terms of putting people before profits, of supporting their employees through retaining jobs and sufficient income levels, and in supporting their suppliers in terms of extending credit and their ability to pay. Now, the importance of this stems from the fact that business in many countries around the world has been the recipient of very substantial funding and support from governments to bail them out in the form of grants, loans, and tax breaks. And it's vital that business recognizes the importance of responding to that, because that government funding was provided on the back of public support that it was needed to bail out failing companies. And that in response, citizens of the world expect business to take forward the recovery from COVID and to do so in a way that benefits not just themselves and their investors, but in particular their stakeholders, societies, and the natural world. Now that stands against the background of what happened after the last crisis that the world faced, the financial crisis of 2008, when again, there was similar support initially from the public in terms of the funding that the banks needed to bail them out. But that public support quickly evaporated when people realized that banks were not responding sufficiently rapidly in terms of adjusting to their new social license to operate. It's particularly important at this stage that business does not squander the goodwill in the way in which it did in regard to the financial crisis by demonstrating that it recognizes its responsibility to the societies that have supported it in this particular crisis. Now, critical to doing that is a recognition of why business exists, what it's there to do, why it is created, namely its purpose. The purpose of a business is its fundamental rationale for being. Now, this notion of corporate purpose was already gaining significance prior to the crisis. It had become the subject of what one of the leaders of the largest investment management businesses in the world, Larry Fink, talked about at the beginning of 2019 in terms of the purpose of business. He said that every business needs to have a purpose, not a strapline or a marketing campaign, but a statement of its fundamental reason for being, what it does on a daily basis. Purpose, he said, is not the sole pursuit of profits, but the animating force for achieving them. Following on that, we had the Business Roundtable in America, recognizing that the purpose of business was no longer the shareholder primacy statement it had made in 1997, but that the purpose of business was to help deliver what customers needed, to invest in employees, to support societies, to contribute to the communities and the suppliers of companies, and to deliver long-term value for their shareholders. The Financial Times set forward a new agenda, capitalism, time for a reset, an agenda that it's maintained right up until now. And the World Economic Forum was on the subject of a universal declaration of the purpose of business in the fourth industrial revolution. But the coronavirus has added real impetus and significance to that notion of corporate purpose, because it gives the mechanism by which business can determine how it should be helping societies, nation states, and economies around the world, as well as its investors, to come out of the current crisis. The purpose of business is important in this regard because it addresses many of the fundamental dilemmas that business is currently facing. Inevitably, business has serious trade-offs that it needs to make between the different parties to the firm, between, for example, the extent to which it supports its employees through retaining them in employment, as against cutting costs and thereby potentially cutting the prices that they have to charge to, in many cases, disadvantaged and vulnerable customers. Or choices in terms of helping societies to address coronavirus through producing ventilators, testing and tracing equipment, through finding remedies for coronaviruses and vaccines. But at the same time, it also has an obligation to its investors to support them in terms of payment of dividends. In the case of pensioners, many of them are highly dependent on those income streams. So how should it balance those interests of society and its investors? Well, that's exactly what a purpose of a company helps a business to do. Because underpinning those purposes are values, values which specify the extent to which companies do prioritize their different parties, their different stakeholders, their customers and their employees, their societies, and their investors, their shareholders. But even more significantly, The purpose of a company tells that firm what it should be doing in terms of trying to move forward out of the current crisis. What are the value propositions that it can put forward in terms of addressing how it's going to build the business in the future? Now that's particularly important as our interests and our priorities as customers, as employees, and as societies are changing in response to coronavirus. For example, in relation to this particular event, this webinar, instead of coming to Cairo to give it, I'm doing it from Oxford. And increasingly, we're going to find ourselves interacting in this way, and new forms of travel and communication are going to develop on the back of it. Now, this offers fantastic opportunities as well as threats to companies. Opportunities to deliver new products and new ways of doing business. And what a purpose of a business does is to establish what businesses can contribute to addressing the changes in our attitudes that are coming out of this particular crisis. So what is a purpose of a company? As I described it just now, it's the fundamental reason why it exists. But it's much more precise than that. The conventional view of what the purpose of a business is one that Milton Friedman put forward during the 1960s and then again in the early 1970s, when he said that there is one and only one social purpose of business: to increase profits so long as it stays within the rules of the game. And that has been the basis of business leadership, business practice, business policy, and business education around the world ever since. But it wasn't always so. Indeed, business was established with a very different purpose some 2,000 years ago under Roman law, as the Societas Publicanorum, an organization that was established to perform very public functions of collecting taxes, minting coins, and looking after public buildings. It's only over the last 60 years that this notion that there is one and only one purpose of business, to make money, has arisen. And that has been the basis of that increasing environmental degradation, inequality, social exclusion, and mistrust to which I referred earlier on. And technology is going to intensify this process, because technological opportunities offer phenomenal potential for improving our well-being as individuals and societies, but also poses risks. Take the example of artificial intelligence. Most of the focus of artificial intelligence is on the future of work. That's not going to be its main implication going forward. It's not just that it's going to substitute for manual labor, it will in time also substitute for mental labor. It will not only help us to make decisions, it will make decisions for us. In the boardroom, in the courtroom, in numerous areas of our everyday life, we will see increasingly machines taking decisions. And that raises fundamental questions about the programs that underlie those machines in terms of who is programming in them and for what purpose. The purpose of a business is not simply to produce profits. The purpose of a business is to produce profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet. And in the process, it produces profits. But the purpose of a business is not primarily to produce profits. Profits are the product of the purpose, not the purpose as such. The purpose of a business, as I've just defined it, is to help us as individuals and societies to solve problems, but not to do so in a philanthropic sense. They're not charities. This is about hard-nosed business. How to convert those notions of solving problems into commercially viable outcomes that are profitable for investors and therefore sustainable for the firms themselves. And that notion of purpose is precise about what purposes a business is there to solve, for whom, how it's going to solve those problems, when it's going to solve those problems by, and why that business is particularly well suited to solving those problems. It's sometimes confused with a mission statement about what a company does. A purpose is not simply descriptive of what a company does. It's sometimes confused with vision statements of aspiration, of companies seeking to solve the problems of the world. It's not that. It's not simply aspirational. It is precise about specific problems that a company is there to solve. Now, I want to illustrate this in relation to a particular example. And the example comes from an industry that is particularly relevant at the moment and much in the news, and that is the pharmaceutical industry. And I'm going to take the example of a Danish pharmaceutical company called Novo Norddisk, which produces insulin. Insulin is used in the treatment of type 2 diabetes. And until a few years ago, Novo Norddisk would define its purpose as being basically to produce insulin. Descriptive, if you like, a mission statement. But then it realized, well, actually, that is not what its purpose is. Its purpose is to solve problems. What are the problems that it's trying to solve? It's trying to solve the problems of how to treat diabetes for those who have the misfortune to get diabetes. So it started working with hospitals and doctors and universities around the world to identify the best ways of treating type 2 diabetes. And then it realized, well, actually, its purpose wasn't even simply to help people treat type 2 diabetes. It should be to help people avoid getting type 2 diabetes in the first place. And its purpose is now basically to try and eradicate type 2 diabetes in the world. So it started working with national governments, local governments, health workers, to identify the changes in lifestyle that would help people to avoid getting type 2 diabetes in the first place. Now you might say, oh, well, that's all very worthy and very noble, but didn't it fundamentally undermine the basic business model of Novo Norddisk? And the answer is no, exactly the opposite. It has helped its business boom. Why? Because in the process of building up those relationships with hospitals, with doctors, the universities, governments, local authorities, health workers, it established relations of trust with them. It became a trusted supplier of information and advice on health matters, and a trusted supplier of pharmaceutical and other health products. Now, what that case illustrates is, I think, two things. The first is the importance of precision about what a corporate purpose is. And that journey that Novo Norddisk went through was one in which they began to identify and realize what that company's real purpose was. And the second thing I think it illustrates is the fact that in the process of trying to actually implement that purpose, it had to build up relations with other parties. It was seeking to solve a complex problem not just of how you treat type 2 diabetes, but how you change people's lifestyles. It couldn't do that on its own. It had to work with other parties in terms of solving those problems. And that was the basis on which it was then establishing relationships of trust, by which other parties could then see the trustworthiness of that business. Now that is a critical insight, because it's basically telling you two things. A, what it takes to make a purpose effective, clarity in terms of the nature of the purpose of the business, and secondly, connectedness, engaging with lots of parties in terms of solving those problems. And that in turn requires the building up of those relationships that then in turn create one of the most valuable assets of all of companies, and that is the extent to which they are trusted by other parties. Now, I want to say a little bit more about what it takes to create really purposeful businesses. And I'm going to suggest that there are three key components. The first of which is leadership, the leadership of organizations. First question that arises is, well, whose responsibility is it to define the purpose of a company? When a company is founded, it's quite clear. It's the owner, the founder owner of the business. But over time, that ownership becomes more diffuse and more dispersed until a company is listed on the stock market, and when it becomes very dispersed. And at that stage, it's hard to argue that, well, any individual shareholder is in a position of defining the purpose. So then it gradually moves from the founder through perhaps some family owners to the board of the company and to the executive. And so the role of the leaders of organizations in defining a purpose is critically important. But that process of identifying the purpose should not just be a top-down activity. It should be one that engages people throughout the organization, so that there is a real buy-in from everyone within the organization that they have contributed to the formulation of that purpose. And that comes on to the second element, which is critically important. And that is in terms of its enactment in the business, its embodiment in the business, because it has to become an integral part of the business. And it's not just the role of the board to implement that. It's the role of everybody in the organization, because it's not just the shareholders and the formal owners who need to own that purpose. It's everyone throughout the organization. There has to be a sense of ownership that pervades within an organization if it's really going to deliver what is intended of it. So the nature of ownership of a corporate purpose is a critically important feature. And let me come back to the case of Novo Norddisk, because it's important in that regard to understand the ownership, the formal ownership of Novo Norddisk. It's listed on the Danish stock market and actively traded, but it has one dominant owner, the Novo Norddisk Foundation, which owns a quarter of the shares of Novo Norddisk, but 3/4 of the voting rights. And that is important because it's given the stability of ownership to Novo Norddisk, which has allowed it to implement that purpose, that ambitious purpose of the business. But having got the backing of its owner, the foundation, it was then incumbent on the board to ensure that everyone in the organization bought into it and felt a sense of ownership of it. Now, the culture and the values of an organization are critical to that acceptance of ownership within an organization. But so too is the third component that I want to emphasize alongside leadership and ownership, and that is, in essence, the governance and the measurement of performance. Because governance is about how do you translate the notion of that purpose into something that becomes a real focus of the business going forward. And to do that, it has to measure its performance against its purpose. Traditionally, we measure performance of companies in terms of one thing: their financial performance, their profit. And that's critically important. It has to be the case that profit remains a primary consideration, as I was suggesting, the definition of a purpose. But one has to be clear as to what is an appropriate measure of a profit. A profit should reflect the fact that the company is not, and remember that second part of my definition of a purpose, that a company should not profit from producing problems for people or planet. In other words, it should ensure that it provides for the costs that avoid it creating harm for other parties. And to the extent that it does, in some respects, harm other parties, it should clean up the mess. It should make provisions and it should provide for costs associated with rectifying and remedying the damage that it does to others. But even more significantly, it should measure its performance in a positive sense of helping to solve problems through measuring the extent to which it is really contributing towards solving the problems of its customers, its societies, and the natural world. And for that, we have observed over the last few years the emergence of a whole series of new forms of measuring performance, sometimes described under the heading of environmental, social, and governance factors, which are critical to the success of companies in delivering on their purpose. Now, the importance of that is that in relation to the incentives within organizations, those incentives have to be aligned with the purpose. The culture is critical and the values that underpin that culture are critically important. But so too are the basic incentives in the form of remuneration and promotion. And people in the organizations should feel that those are integral to the successful delivery of their purpose, and it needs aligning those then with those metrics which reflect the success of the company in delivering on its purpose. Those three elements of leadership, ownership, governance, and measurement are the ones that are key in terms of ensuring that the purpose of a company is embedded in the organization. And that notion of the purpose being beyond just a pure financial objective is what is required to really ensure that business makes that contribution to resolving the problems that we face from the current pandemic, for avoiding the type of disillusionment that has set in post the financial crisis recurring after this crisis, and for ensuring that business is at the forefront in terms of the recovery of economies around the world in a form that is of benefit to all of the stakeholders in the firm, as well as to the investors who put up the funding to allow that to occur.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. This was very insightful. Now, audience, please, if you have any question, please type it in your chat box and the team will collect your questions. I have like a few comments. What you said is fantastic. It's very clear. It's very, the whole system is rigged in favor of the large corporations. The large corporations are in a compromising position, so they compromise. I mean, if I push a little bit the system, I could produce conducive environment that I could take advantage of, and they do that. They do that. Now, the issue for me, I mean, when you talk about COVID-19, yes, it makes an urgency, more sense of urgency, that I need to have a business that is more attuned with the environment, more attuned with the people, etc. The issue of mechanism is still very hard. I mean, one of the major issues, for example, we had a speaker a while back, and she was talking about business and human rights, and how large corporations in the start of the COVID-19, they've canceled orders in developing countries. Just cold blank, they've canceled orders. And what she was arguing is the trust, the social capital they will lose. Now, the problem is, how do you measure social capital? How do you measure trustworthiness of a company? It's extremely hard. So this is one question. Now, the other thing which is very different, you've mentioned ESG. Most corporations, when they use ESG, they even put it under risk assessment. So they do it mainly to ensure that they do no harm, or maybe even they don't get caught doing harm. This is very different than the intention of doing good. Now, there are some companies that they have this in their DNA. Like an example of Novo Norddisk, another example is Mars, the economies of mutuality, for example. But this, as you've mentioned, it happens from the very beginning, from the roots. And somehow it was put on the right path, so they stayed on the right path. I mean, we talk about Mars. I mean, Cadbury started also with a very good social mandate, creating a nice environment for their workforce. When you compare Cadbury now with Mars, there's a tremendous difference, and it could be because of the ownership issue that you've alluded to. I just wanted to sort of hear your views about this until we get a chance from others to sort of get more questions.
Those are great questions, Ali. Thank you very much indeed for raising them. First of all, let me say that you're absolutely right to focus on large corporations, because large corporations really have the power to either be a remarkable force for good or not. Small companies are a very important part of the economy, but there is a great deal that has to be sorted out in relation to the largest corporations. Now, the key to doing that is exactly to move to a recognition of what they are there to do. And this notion that in essence, ESG is good enough because it reflects the extent to which they are being responsible, that is not good enough. Responsible business is essentially about avoiding doing harm. That is not what we are looking for. We are looking for business to recognize that it is there to solve problems. Now, this is what I describe as being a business innovation. It's like a technological innovation. In many cases, it involves technological advances. But it starts from a proposition that says, we want to create a significant improvement in terms of the way in which particular parts of society are operating. We've identified a problem. And I was talking this morning in one of my classes about the Brazilian company, Natura, okay, which is a large company which has just recently taken over Body Shop, which set out as its initial objectives to address a whole series of issues that arose in relation to the Amazon forest. It's a Brazilian company that took that as its initial objective. And so it recognized from the beginning that what it was trying to do was to solve problems in terms of the natural environment of the Amazon forest, and also of the indigenous people within that. And it set about identifying precisely what those problems were and mechanisms by which it can convert those into commercial opportunities. It flourished on the back of it. It's now an extremely profitable company that has been able to acquire companies around the world in terms of building its business. That mindset of saying, well, actually, the type of business we should be trying to create is one that doesn't just simply say we are there to make money, and then to presume that, well, if they're making money, there might be some social good that comes of it. It's to start from posing a point about what are the things that we want business to do and to design business around that. Now, you may say to me, oh, that sounds absolutely great, but it's all wishful thinking, because we know at the end of the day that all that business is going to do is essentially exploit people to, whenever there's an opportunity to make money, cut costs. And the example that you were given of the human rights issues in terms of business just stopping using some suppliers around the world is an illustration of that. How does one solve that problem? One solves that problem by two mechanisms, one of which is to say that is actually not good business for businesses. Why? Because of the fact that it gives rise to undermining what I've just described as being a really vital element in terms of creating successful businesses, and that is to build up those relations of trust. But there's a second element which is critical to bringing this about, and that is that the way in which we have formulated business in the legal structures and our regulatory structures is basically around the notion of simply having profit as the primary objective. So corporate law in most countries essentially emphasizes the significance of companies in promoting their success for the benefit of their shareholders. What we need to do is to put the notion of corporate purpose at the heart of company law around the world, so that the primary duties of directors would be then to specify a purpose and to demonstrate how they are delivering on that purpose. Now, you might say, that sounds great, but it's not going to happen. Well, I can tell you it is happening. This is moving at great pace now. And one of the reasons why it's moving at great pace is a recognition that the existing model is failing. That recognition, as I described at the beginning, was already happening predominantly in relation to the E of ESG, the environment, and in particular climate change. That was the main driving force behind the Business Roundtable, behind Larry Fink's statement, etc. But what COVID has done is to say that the S is as important as the E. And what we have witnessed happening in relation to Black Lives Matter is an increasing recognition that that is applicable not just in relation to the pandemic, but also to a whole series of social issues of inequality and exclusion that I was alluding to at the beginning. So that notion of there needing to be a change is gaining real credibility now. And to give you one illustration, the UK 2 years ago changed its corporate governance code by which boards of directors have to run the largest and the smallest companies in Britain, all companies in Britain, to put purpose, corporate purpose, at the heart of the UK corporate governance code. Now that's a very significant move, but I'm also going to suggest to you that COVID is going to be an even more powerful mover of change over the next few years. Because I started off by saying that what we're experiencing with COVID is the need for governments to bail out large segments of corporate sectors around the world. And that came as quite a shock to many people, particularly in business, because there was a view that was growing that business was bigger than governments, that it was substituting for governments, that it didn't really need government any longer to deliver public services. Well, we now realize that that was nonsense, that business isn't bigger than government. It's highly dependent on government. And now, having put up that money, and in many cases facing risks of financial failure and bankruptcy going forward, business is going to be increasingly dependent on the support of government. And so this is an opportunity for governments in terms of their public procurement, in terms of their funding of business, in terms of their public-private partnerships, to say as part of that, the quid pro quo is that business has to demonstrate that its objectives are more than just making money, but actually to contribute to a positive enhancement of societies and of humans around the world. So this is a time at which the relationship between government is a mechanism by which governments can provide incentives for companies to move in the direction of putting purpose at the heart of their activities.
Thank you, sir. Now I'm going to pass to Kariman, and she's going to ask the questions that are compiled from the audience. Kariman, floor is yours, my dear.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ali. Thank you so much, Professor Colin. That's so inspiring. Okay, first question. Don't you think that the COVID-19 pandemic exposed the need to integrate human rights specialists in the crisis management teams? We would like to hear your views about that. And if you can talk a bit about other alternative models by which business can understand human rights risks in their supply chains.
Fine.
Yes.
Okay, so human rights has really risen up the agenda as a consequence of COVID. And in essence, what has occurred has been a recognition that we have in the past been treating people too much like commodities. And that there's been a notion in particular around the globalization debate that all that we were doing from thinking about how to manage our supply chains was to manage costs, minimize costs. That was the primary objective behind contracting out to different parts of the world. What we have recognized from the crisis is that that model was entirely wrong. There was a growing recognition of that before the crisis, with a failure of many of the supply chains to be able to deliver because of the fact that they were cutting costs to a point that those supply chains were just failing in terms of their reliability and the quality of their provisions. But since the crisis, we've recognized that actually it's much more serious than that. It's a failure of business to realize that those people in their supply chains are the most valuable parts of their assets alongside their people in their own employment. And that they have to support them in terms of their ability to be able to continue. The continuity of business in many cases is under threat because they can't get access to the necessary supply chains. Now that followed on a previous experience of companies shifting to those global supply chains and cutting out their domestic suppliers because they were too expensive. And so at the same time as there's a greater recognition of the importance of the global supply chains, there's also a greater recognition of the importance of domestic supply chains as well. And so we're suddenly getting a recognition within companies of the need to build up those relationships that are long-term relationships where they are helping their suppliers and their suppliers are thereby helping them. And one of the things that came out of the Edelman Trust Barometer that I put up at the beginning was that people around the world believe that that is what companies need to be prioritizing alongside prioritizing their own employees.
Thank you so much. Another question we have, the private sector in Egypt is mainly dominated by family business model. Unlike the mainstream thought, some argue that it's actually easier to convert companies with block holders or businesses that are family owned to be more responsible than other types of businesses. Is that true? We would like to hear your thoughts about that.
Okay, so Egypt is like actually most countries in the world where the dominant form of ownership is in the form of family ownership. Even in the largest listed companies, in most countries in the world, families are by far and away the largest single holders of blocks of shares, significant blocks of shares in companies. Now that allows families to be able to exercise particular influence on companies and to be able to help companies to specify their purposes. Now that influence can be then a phenomenal force for good. And there's a growing movement that says that families should indeed be that force for good going forward. And a lot of the next generation of family owners are looking for their family businesses to do that. And in some cases, they're saying, look, we're simply not willing to take on running the family business in the way in which you, our parents have been running the business, because we think that there should be much more of an emphasis on the real reason and purpose of the business. So there's a change that's taking place. But having said that, in some cases, family business does exactly the opposite, because it can exercise that power. It can be a force for good or a force for bad outcomes. And in some cases, it gives rise to corruption, mismanagement, manipulation in such a way as to produce what are perceived to be benefits for the family, but come at the great detriment to the environment, to the public sector, to governments around the world. And if one wants to think of an example of this, you only basically have to think about what's happened in relation to Purdue Pharma in the US and the opioid scandal. There is an example of what is a family-owned business that has actually caused immense problems for generations of people in terms of the impact that that company has had on lives around the world.
Thank you. 2 questions. Business create wealth. We want them to create wealth with a purpose as profitable solutions to social and environmental issues. This shift needs incentives. What are the accepted government regulatory incentives you propose to make this shift? Okay,
a great question. And regulation is critically important, as is the law, in terms of ensuring that this actually gets delivered. And I've already talked about the law as being an important element in terms of encouraging companies to put purpose at the heart of them. There's a very good illustration of a law that does this in the United States called the Public Benefit Corporation. What a public benefit corporation is a corporation that has a public purpose alongside its commercial functions. It's the role of the owners to help specify that purpose, and then it's a fiduciary responsibility of the directors to uphold that public purpose, as well as to deliver financial returns to their investors. But in addition to the law, regulation of companies is very important. And so issues around environmental regulation and taxation alongside regulation are an important mechanism for ensuring that companies abide by social objectives. But the point that I'm emphasizing is that there needs to be an alignment between those regulatory rules and the objectives of companies. A major problem that we've had to date has been the separation between the two. That we've had regulators on the one hand, upholding the public interest, and companies on the other hand, being interested in just one thing, and that is to make money. And that conflict between the interests of regulators and companies has undermined the regulatory process. It's meant that companies have done what they can to circumvent regulation, to get round it, and if possible, turn it to a competitive advantage. And so regulators have increasingly recognized, well, actually, they've got to change what they do. So, for example, in relation to the financial crisis, initially, the regulatory bodies thought, well, it's just a matter of clarifying the rules and ensuring that they're enforced more effectively than they have been in the past. They quickly realized it wasn't as simple as that. It wasn't just about crime and punishment. It was also about ensuring that the culture of financial institutions was conducive to them supporting those regulatory objectives. So regulators then had to start to work with banks in terms of saying, well, okay, well, how can we help you change the cultures of your organization? Now that's an illustration of a gradual realization on the part of regulators that they need to think about more purposeful regulation. They are not just there to state the regulatory rules and to enforce them. They are there to ensure that regulation encourages companies to promote purposes that are aligned with the interests of us as societies and the natural world.
Thank you. Is there limitations to the Novaris successful model that might differ when applied to other organizations, like the size of the company, credibility and reputation that it built over the years, or the value of knowledge-derived industries?
So that type of model that I'm just talking about is really very relevant across the knowledge-intensive industries. Particularly so in the context of high-tech companies. Just think about the social media firms and the immense impact that they've had on our lives. The way in which we are now interacting, if it hadn't been developed over the last 20 or so years, would have made our experience of COVID and lockdown around the world a very different one. A very much more isolated one than it actually has been, because we can communicate through these various social media and networking devices. So it's played an absolutely critical role in enhancing our well-being. But at the same time, we've observed that many of the social media companies, social networking companies, have gone beyond a boundary that societies find acceptable. And in particular, in relation to use of data, they have transgressed what we regard as being the way in which they should be conducting their business. Now that then illustrates the importance of purpose as being at the heart of those high-tech companies, that what they should be doing is to think in terms of how do they solve problems? Well, if you think about companies like Facebook and LinkedIn, Twitter, they had a clear notion of the problems that they were trying to solve. But they also need to recognize the second part of that purpose statement about not producing problems for people and planet. And the use of data is a key element in terms of thinking about, well, could we be creating problems by essentially utilizing people's data in a way that they're not aware of? And the answer is obviously yes. So once you begin to think in terms of the purpose of that company and what it means in the round in terms of the positive contribution and the avoidance of the negative, then that really helps those social media and high-tech companies to avoid the types of difficulties that some of them have recently encountered.
Thank you. With the suppression of civil freedom in different parts of the world, do you think that the role of civil society in making sure that businesses are actually doing what they say they do will expand, be limited, or stay the same? And it would be great if you can tell us if staying the same would be sufficient. Okay, the answer is no, they're not going to stay the same, and staying the same would certainly not be sufficient. And one of the reasons why it's not going to stay the same is coming back to this point of technology. Alongside the risk of having a hedge fund activist come into a company, buy up shares, and try to change the board of a firm, the thing that boards of companies now fear almost more than anything else is the risk of a social media campaign against them.
okay, and particularly in the current crisis. There have been lots of companies that have been called out for not doing what societies and their employees and their customers expect of them. And the reason why this has become so much more powerful than it has been in the past is the emergence of social media and the fact that it is so much easier now to rally thousands, if not millions of people around particular causes that can be made very public, that this has become such a powerful tool. And since, as I was saying, trust is one of the most important assets of a business, the risk of a reputational hit to a company is phenomenal. So companies increasingly going forward will be concerned about their image and the way in which they are treating societies and individuals for fear of what might otherwise occur in terms of social media campaigns against them.
Thank you. What is the ideal role that business schools should have, if any, in determining the future of the social contract between government, people, and businesses?
Okay, well, thank you for raising that, because as a former dean of the Oxford Business School and a professor at one, this is an issue that is of great interest to me. And to my mind, business schools should be playing an absolutely lead role. They should be trying to mold the leaders that we want of the future and the managers of companies of the future. And that requires an understanding that the nature of that leadership is going to have to change in a direction of this notion of business as a potentially powerful force for solving our problems. And business schools can really provide the basis on which people are inspired with that as the vision as to what they want to do in their careers going forward, and to provide them with the tools to be able to do that in practice. So business schools are going to be an absolute linchpin in bringing about the change that we're looking to achieve in terms of a new business model for the 2020s and thereafter.
Thank you so much, Professor Colin. We have actually other questions, but I guess the time won't be sufficient. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed for them.
Colin, it's been a pleasure. And I think with your lecture, actually, you made an interesting introduction to our next webinars. The next one, we're going to have Jeff Mazzolo. He's going to talk about ESG. The title of his presentation are going to be ESG, Global Supply Chains, Long-Termism, and the Future of Finance. Now, interesting enough, also on Tuesday, we have a speaker from a consulting company. It's a Dutch consulting company. It's called Better Future. It's the way they define themselves, it's a purpose-driven consultancy. And interesting enough, she's going to be talking about the B Corps. What are the standards of a B Corps? I mean, other interesting forms of businesses that are engaged more in a better way with society. It's been a pleasure, and I really thank you. And I'm going to send you a link with the recording as soon as we have it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to do it. I enjoyed it a great deal. So thank you to both of you.
It's our pleasure. Thank you, the audience, and please keep tuned and follow us, please. Thank you. Bye-bye.